This past week, I was talking to Gabby, my wife, and mentioning to them that Rosh Shana is coming up, certainly a time when everyone classically attends shul, Beit Knesset, tries their best to go to the local yard, case as it is this particular year. And I reflected upon the fact that I certainly hope that our children, our daughters, our sons will be able to join us for tefillah, or at least to attend for the majority of tefillah, of the service itself. Upon which Gabby responded by saying, they might not want to necessarily come. And I said, I don't understand. Rosh Shana, a time of davening, a time of reflection, of tefillah. How or why would it be that they would not want to come to shul to be a part of the service? To which she responded something very, very insightful. And she said, maybe this year, after the loss of Gila, the loss of their sister, maybe they will feel that it's not really upon them or incumbent upon them to ask mechila, to ask forgiveness from Hashem. Maybe they have deeper feelings. Perhaps they feel personally that God should ask forgiveness from them, kiviyachol, for what happened to them, for the tragedy which struck our family at its core. And I thought to myself, that might be for someone in our particular circumstance, that might be a appropriate or an acceptable response. But certainly as a religious observant, someone who believes in God, it's a very, very difficult response to accept, to swallow. And I asked myself, or I said to myself, what exactly is the response to such a complaint, to such a subject? And I said that perhaps the answer is twofold. Firstly, one of the things that we have to recognize is that Rosh Shana itself is not necessarily a day of mechila, of asking forgiveness from Hashem. Prior to one's asking forgiveness, or for one's asking anything for that matter from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from Hashem, one must first recognize the divinity, the sanctity, the greatness of Hashem, the power, the awesomeness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu represents. This is Rosh Shana, the day in which we recognize, in which we give credence to His divinity, to His having created the world for our benefit, for our use, and ultimately to be able to serve and to connect with Him in this world as well. And therefore, Rosh Hashanah is a day of recognition, of coming to that realization, the awesomeness of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu represents. But that is a very difficult thing for us to recognize on a personal level in our family, particularly this year, after we have been struck with the death, the demise of Gila. So how exactly does one come to that recognition on this particular year on a personal note? And I saw an interesting thing at the beginning of this week's Parsha. The beginning of the Parsha offers the directive, the commandment, in which one is supposed to bring the bikurim, the first fruits, to Yerushalayim, offer it up to a Kohen, and recite a history, a historical account of what happened to the Jewish people in their journey of Avram Avinu, Abraham, our forefather, in coming to that recognition of Hashem. And sure enough, the Torah says at the conclusion of this mitzvah, "V'samachta b'chol hatov asher natan lacha Hashem Elokecha uleveitecha ata v'alevi v'ager asher b'kirbecha." V'samachta b'chol hatov asher natan lacha Hashem. You should be happy, joyous, with regards to all of the good that God has graced upon you. And again, on a personal note, I said to myself, really? What exactly or how exactly am I supposed to experience happiness in the state of morose sadness, in the state of mourning and reflection upon mourning? And I saw an interesting comment by the Rashar Hirsch, Rav Shamshon Mefal Hirsch, and he says as follows, doesn't make it necessarily easier. V'samachta, skirat ha'avar, when one reviews the past, hevi'a otcha lidei ha'akara she'alecha lehodot rak laHashem ala atzmut v'habracha shel ha'oveh. When one reflects upon past events, that is meant to bring them to a greater understanding, comprehension, or at the very least appreciation of Hashem regarding all the events that transpire and unfold in front of him in the present. In other words, reflecting upon the past is supposed to help us with regards to an appreciation of the present. V'hakara zu chidsha belibcha et hitmasrutcha laHashem. And this recognition, this understanding, this appreciation of the present as a result of the past is meant to lead and to incite or encourage greater subservience to Hashem as well. Al Yesod Kol Eile, based on these foundations, Atayachol Lismoach Lifnei Hashem. When one follows this precedent, one is capable of ultimately thanking and giving thanks and appreciating the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think what the Rashar Hirsch is suggesting, because if you look at it face value, in other words, again, you'll excuse me, from a selfish projective, I would say, well, if I'm going to reflect upon the past, how has that possibly helped me to be happy with regards to the present? If anything, it leads me into a darker and deeper place of sadness. And I think what the Rashar Hirsch is saying is that if we understand that there always is something, sometimes in greater magnitude, sometimes in smaller, but there's always something that we can be thankful for, perhaps that is the recipe for success in this life that we live. If we realize that even if we look at the past, and of course there are things that we can complain about and that can bring us to tragic and deep sadness, nonetheless, if we arrive at some reflection and we say, currently, I am given the opportunity to have life, to appreciate, and to somehow find some form or fashion of thanks with regards to what is happening around me in the present, perhaps that will or that is the recipe for success in our lives. And that really leads me to the second part, or the middle of the Parsha, where we proclaim the famous blessings and chas v'chalila, the curses that would befall upon the Jewish people, the recipe for success if we follow the Torah, and of course the recipe for disaster if we do not, God forbid. And in the core of these brachot is the famous proclamation, Baruch atah b'tzeitecha u'baruch atah Baruch atah bevoecha u'baruch atah b'tzeitecha. Blessed are you in your arrival, blessed are you in your departure. And what exactly does this mean? Also subject to interpretation. The Gemara in Baba Metzia says a very strange thing at first glance. What is Baruch atah bevoecha u'baruch atah b'tzeitecha sheyeh tze'etzei me'echa kamocha? Baruch atah b'tzeitecha, in that which leaves, departs. It's referring to actually tze'etzei me'echa, that which comes from your loins, your children. Blessed are you that your children should be kamotcha, should be like you. And one of the things that I thought about is, really? When I look at myself, I'm not quite certain, I'm not quite sure that I'd be happy to proclaim that my children should be like me. Perhaps I'd aspire to something far greater and perhaps far different. So what exactly does this mean? And I think that the Gemara is telling us that when we look at certain things, we have to gain a certain perspective. This week, I was in the mall and I went shopping with our son, Sruli, at the age of 16. I went to buy him some clothing, and during the time I saw that he was in a bad mood, and that put me in a bad mood. And obviously with our emotions running haywire, there are times when I will behave inexplicably immature, inappropriately, because of the various emotions that I have and the cocktail that's running through me. And sure enough, I said in a state of frustration, I have to go. I left the store. I found myself a table that I could sit down in the mall, and I just sat there on my lonesome, reflecting within myself. And to a certain extent, I thought to myself, perhaps Srili, our son, will just continue on, and maybe I'll catch up with him later. And sure enough, after a few minutes of reflecting, Srili approached me, And he sat down, he found where I was in the mall, and he sat down and he looked at me for a while without saying anything. And after a few minutes he said, Abba, I understand you. I'm with you. I also am frustrated and sad and angry at times, and I get that it happens to you as well, but I'm here for you. And it's at that moment that I said to myself, I understand what the Talmud, what the Gemara is telling us. There's no question that we have concern for one another, and there's no question that we have concern for our children. What the Gemara is telling us, Shiyu tze'etzei me'echa kamotcha, the same concern that we as parents have for children, we hope and pray that our children will have that same concern for us. It's not that they should be like us. It's not that they should exhibit the same characteristics. It's that the same love and the same concern that we have for them, we hope and pray that we are blessed, that they should show that concern for us as well, as our son Sruli did for me at this particular juncture. And I suppose that that is something that we should be thankful for, to have a son, to have a child who comes and demonstrates that love and that care and that concern. There's no question that with regards to Gila's death, we will always be stuck in the past as the Parshat HaShavua begins. We will always be pained, and we will always be fixated to a certain extent on that pain. However, the Torah beseeches from us, as we approach Rosh Shana, to also focus on the present, to recognize the beauty, the children and grandchildren, and the family that surrounds us. And perhaps if we understand this as well, and if we realize and recognize that, as Rashar Hirsch suggested, that we are meant to reflect upon the past, but to give credence to the present, to the opportunity that we have to revive, to resuscitate that relationship, that rapport with Hashem once again on a Rosh Shana. That we have opportunity to say to Hashem, hey, maybe you should ask forgiveness from us this year, but at the same time to recognize that maybe it's upon us to pray to Him as well. Then perhaps all of the kalalot, the curses and the personal curse that has fallen upon us this year, will transform and reveal themselves into a bracha as well. And perhaps this is how we are expected to see things this way, the Gila way. Shabbat Shalom.